All right, today's section on the French and Indian War is a very important section in American history. We are going to cover a lot today, but first I'll start you with one American story. Charles de Langlade was born in 1729. He was the son of a French fur trader and his Ottawa wife. His family controlled the fur trade around what is now Green Bay. In 1752, Charles commanded 250 Ottawa and Chippewa warriors in an attack on the village of Pickawillany in present day Ohio. His reason: the Miami people who lived there had stopped trading with the French and were now trading with the British. Charles and his men destroyed the village's British trading post and killed the Miami chief. This attack helped lead to the French and Indian War. This section describes the war in which French forces fought British forces in North America. Each side had Native American allies. Charles de Langlade led several successful attacks against the British, but in the end he saw the British drive French armies from the continent. Now, by the end of today, you should be able to identify French colonial claims, which we'll talk about first. You should be able to trace the French and Indian War. You should be able to explain how the British won the French and Indian War, and then we should, by the end, should be able to evaluate the results of the war. Now, as we talked about in chapters 2 and 4, the French were exploring the North American interior while English colonies were settling the eastern coast. By the late 1600s, French explorers had claimed the Ohio River Valley, the Mississippi River Valley, and the entire Great Lakes region. The French territory of Louisiana, claimed by the explorer La Salle in 1682, stretched from the Appalachian Mountains all the way out to the Rocky Mountains. The French built their main settlements, Quebec and Montreal, along the St. Lawrence River in Canada. Before we go on, I want to also show you this is what the territories looked like at this time around the late 1600s. The American colonies are in light pink. The French colonies are in blue, and as you can see here, Wisconsin is totally under the blue part. And then we see Spanish Florida and other Spanish claims in orange. So, like I said, the French built their main settlements, Quebec and Montreal, along the St. Lawrence River in Canada. They also had built forts along the Great Lakes and along rivers draining into the Mississippi. By 1760, the French colony New France had a European population of about 80,000 people. By contrast, at this time, the British colonies had more than 1 million settlers. So here you can see a map between Montreal and Quebec City. Now, some of the Europeans in New France were Jesuit priests. They wanted to convert Native Americans to Christianity. Other Europeans in New France worked as fur traders, and Native Americans brought furs to French forts and exchanged them for goods such as iron pots and steel knives. Many French fur traders carried goods by canoe into remote parts of New France. Right here, this is Father Marquette, who was a Jesuit priest, which is where Marquette University is named after in Milwaukee. So the English competed with the French for furs. Also, different Native American groups competed to supply furs to the Europeans. The fur trade created economic and military alliances between the Europeans and their Native American trading partners. The Huron and Algonquin peoples of the Great Lakes region were allied with the French, and the Iroquois of Upper New York often were allied with the Dutch, and later the English. Alliances between Europeans and Native Americans led to their involvement in each other's wars. For example, by the mid 1600s, the Iroquois had trapped all the beaver in their own lands, so to get more furs, they made war on their Huron and Algonquin neighbors, driving them west. Eventually, the Iroquois controlled an area ranging from Maine west to the Ohio Valley and north to Lake Michigan. See, I lost my spot here, sorry. So Iroquois expansion threatened the French fur trade, so in response, the French armed the Huron and Algonquin peoples to fight the Iroquois. The Iroquois were armed by the English. When France and England declared war on each other in Europe in 1689, French and English colonists in America also began to fight. With their Native American allies, they attacked each other's settlements and forts. and during the 1700s, two more wars between France and England fueled wars in the colonies. Neither side won a clear victory in any of these wars, so we needed a final war known as the French and Indian War that decided which nation would control the northern and eastern parts of North America. And here you can see British forces fighting with Native Americans. So the seeds for the French and Indian Wars were planted when British fur traders began moving into the Ohio River Valley in the 1750s. British land companies were also planning to settle colonists there. The French and their Native American allies became alarmed. To keep the British out of the valley, Charles de Langley had destroyed the village of Pickawillany and its British trading post. Here you can see Pickawillany in a map of present-day western Ohio. The British traders left and the French built forts to protect the region linking their Canadian Louisiana settlements. This really upset the Virginia colony, which claimed title to the land. In 1753, the lieutenant governor of Virginia sent a small group of soldiers to tell the French to leave. Their leader was a 21-year-old major named George Washington. Washington reported the French commander's reply, which was, "He told me the country belonged to them, that no Englishman had a right to trade upon them waters, and that he had orders to make every person prisoner that attempted it on the Ohio or the waters of it." Virginia's lieutenant governor sent about 40 men to build a fort at the head of the Ohio River, where Pittsburgh stands today. French and Native American troops seized the partially built fort in 1754 and completed it themselves. The French named it Fort Duquesne. George Washington was on his way to defend Fort Duquesne when he learned of its surrender. He and his men pushed on and built another small fort, Fort Necessity. Following Washington's surprise attack on a French force, the French and their allies attacked Fort Necessity on July 3, 1754. After Washington surrendered, the French led a march back to Virginia. The French and Indian War had begun. This war became part of the 7 Years' War, which is a larger worldwide struggle for empire between France and Great Britain. While Washington was surrendering Fort Necessity, representatives from the British colonies and the Iroquois nations were meeting at Albany, New York. The colonists wanted the Iroquois to fight with them against the French, and the Iroquois would not commit to this alliance. Benjamin Franklin, who admired the union of the 6 Iroquois nations, suggested the colonies band together for defense. His Albany Plan of Union was the first formal proposal to unite the colonies. The plan called for each colony to send representatives to a Grand Council. This council would be able to collect taxes, raise armies, make treaties, and start new settlements. The leaders in Albany supported Franklin's plan, but the colonial legislators later defeated it because they did not want to give up control of their own affairs. So Britain realized that to win the war, it could not rely solely on the colonists for funding for troops. Therefore, the British sent General Edward Braddock, this man here on the right, and 2 regiments to Virginia. In 1755, Braddock marched toward the French at Fort Duquesne. Washington was at his side, and the red-coated army of 2,100 moved slowly over the mountains, weighed down by a huge cannon. On July 9th, on a narrow trail 8 miles from Fort Duquesne, fewer than 900 French and Indian troops surprised Braddock's forces. Washington suggested that his men break formation and fight from behind the trees, but Braddock would not listen. The general held his position and had 4 horses shot out from under him. Washington lost 2 horses. 4 bullets went through Washington's coat, but miraculously none of them actually hit him. In the end, nearly 1,000 men were killed or wounded, and General Braddock died from his wounds. American colonists were stunned by Braddock's defeat and by many other British losses over the next 2 years. In 1757, Britain had a new Secretary of State, William Pitt, who was determined to win the war in the colonies. He sent the nation's best generals to America and borrowed money to pay colonial troops for fighting. The British controlled 6 French forts by August of 1759, including Fort Duquesne, which was later rebuilt as Fort Pitt. In late summer, the British began to attack New France at its capital, Quebec. Quebec sat on cliffs about 300 feet above the St. Lawrence River. Cannons and thousands of soldiers guarded its thick walls. British General James Wolfe sailed around the fort for 2 months, unable to capture it. Then in September, a scout found a steep, unguarded path up the cliffs to the plains just west of Quebec. At night, Wolfe and 4,000 of his men floated to the path and secretly climbed the cliffs. When the French awoke, the British were lined up on the plains ready to attack. In the short, fierce battle that followed, Wolfe was killed. The French commander Montcalm died of his wounds the next day. Quebec then surrendered to the British. The Battle of Quebec was the turning point of the war. When Montreal fell the next year, all of Canada was in British hands. Britain and France battled in other parts of the world for almost 3 more years. Spain finally made a pact in 1761 to aid France, but its help came way too late. When the 7 Years' War ended in 1763, Britain had won. By the Treaty of Paris, Britain claimed all of North America east of the Mississippi River. To reward Spain for its help, France gave it New Orleans and Louisiana, the French territory west of the Mississippi. Britain, which had seized Cuba and the Philippines from Spain, gave them back in exchange for Florida. So the treaty ended French power in all of North America. They literally lost everything. So here's what the land looked like before the French-Indian War. You can see that the French ruled most all of this, and Great Britain only had what is now the 13 colonies and some land that they disputed and shared. This is what it looked like after the Treaty of Paris. You can see Great Britain controls almost everything, and Spain is left with a very large chunk of land west of the Mississippi, but for the most part, Great Britain has everything they could ever want. So after the French forces withdrew, the British took over their forts. They refused to give supplies to the Native Americans as the French had. British settlers also moved across the mountains on a Native American land. In the spring and summer of 1763, Native American groups responded by attacking settlers and destroying almost every British fort west of the Appalachians. They surrounded the remaining forts, and this revolt was called Pontiac's Rebellion, although the Ottawa war leader Pontiac was only one of many organizers. British settlers reacted with equal viciousness, killing even Indians who had not attacked them. British officers came up with a brutal plan to end the Delaware siege at Fort Pitt. The officers invited Delaware war leaders in to talk and then give them smallpox-infected blankets as gifts. Sound familiar? This started a deadly outbreak. By the fall, the Native Americans had retreated. Even so, the uprising made the British government see that defending western lands would be costly. Therefore, the British issued the Proclamation of 1763, which forbade colonists to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. The colonists were irate. They thought they had won the right to settle the Ohio River Valley, which is some of the best farmland in the world. The British government was angry at the colonists who did not want to pay for their own defense. This hostility helped cause the war for American independence, as we'll talk about in Chapter 6. But this proclamation really did set relations back between the British and the colonists. That concludes Chapter 5.